Welcome to this week's video, YouTube, whatever you want to call it, lecture. This week I'm going to talk about Locke's political philosophy. And just so you know, I'm not going to edit this video so that it looks nice and pretty like those videos people make on YouTube and make a lot of money on it. I'm just going to talk in the way I normally talk for a lecture, with all my ums and pauses and mistakes, and just have you watch it. So I apologize that the video is not at the highest quality it could be, but I think what I have is good enough for what we need to do. Okay, so today I'm talking about Locke's political philosophy. Now, if you remember, in last lecture, I said that Hobbes has one of the most quoted sentences in the English language. Now, Locke may or may not have a similar claim to fame. But if he does not, then Locke's claim to fame is that his political philosophy is the single most significant political philosophy from the 1700s to today. Now, Locke's argument that we're going to talk about today, that governments are intended to protect everyone's equal natural rights to freedom, that argument was taken as the best argument against the divine right of kings theory that prevailed in Locke's time. Locke published the Second Treatise on Government, which is the book from which your excerpts are taken. He published that work in 1692, around that time, after England's Glorious Revolution. So England had a king that they had instituted after their first civil war, which was the war that Hobbes lived during. But this new king that they imposed, a lot of people didn't like him, so they got rid of him. But the reason why this revolution, and they got rid of him and instituted a new king, but the reason why this revolution was called the Glorious Revolution is because this revolution was successful without any bloodshed. So it got the name Glorious because it was a happy revolution. As you know, not all revolutions have such a happy ending. So Locke lived during this time, and his theory really, aside from being an argument against the divine right of kings, is an argument for democratic governments, an argument for a government limited by natural rights, but an argument with revolutionary implications. And for all of these reasons, Locke's arguments have been significant, and some of the sentences and arguments that you read today are literally present in the documents of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, the two most important revolutions in modern time. So a lot of stuff going on with Locke's political philosophy. I can't cover it all today. I'm just going to talk about the excerpts that you read. And in particular, I'm going to focus on Locke's argument for the moral justification of political authority. And in doing so, I'm going to give his argument and contrast it with Hobbes's argument. That way, the contrast between Locke and Hobbes allow us to see the similarities in both thinkers, but also their important differences. Allow me to drink my coffee. So the first issue that arises with Locke's philosophy is, well, what is the state of nature? Remember, Hobbes's theory begins in the state of nature in a world without government. Now, Locke takes essentially the same theory of what the state of nature is as Hobbes does. The state of nature is a world without government. And in this world, there is no established law for everyone. There are no judges instituted to resolve disputes according to that law. and there's no centralized or power strong enough to really execute justice. So again, the state of nature here is the same thing as it is in Hobbes. Now, the next question we might ask is, what does morality look like in the state of nature? Now, Locke thinks that although in the state of nature there is no established law, there is nonetheless a different kind of law in the state of nature. And for Locke, this is the moral law, or what he calls the natural law. Now, if you remember in the unit on morality, natural law is just a kind of moral theory. So when Locke talks about natural law or natural rights, for our purposes, we can understand those as moral rights and a moral law. So Locke thinks that there is a moral law that's operative in the state of nature, and the moral law tells us which actions are right and which actions are wrong. Now, the same moral law applies to everyone and binds all humans into one community. So for Locke, in the state of nature, there are things that it's perfectly fine to do. You can live your life, you can protect yourself, you can acquire property. It's morally right to do those things. But in the state of nature, there are things that it's morally wrong to do. It's morally wrong to interfere with the life, liberty, and property of other people. So in the state of nature, everyone has a moral duty to not do those kinds of things. So given this picture of the moral law that's operative in the state of nature, Locke focuses on three basic kinds of rights. First, he says there is a right to, quote, innocent delights. And what he means here is a right to those freedoms which don't interfere with the life, liberty, and property of others. So basically, you can do whatever you want so long as you don't interfere with other people's right to innocent delights. That's the first kind of right. The second kind of right that Locke says we have in the state of nature is a moral right to do whatever we can to preserve our lives, so long as we don't interfere with everybody else's other rights. So I can do what I can to protect myself, so long as I act within the moral law. That's the second kind of moral right. And the third kind of moral right is the right to punish people who violate the moral law. So the right to innocent delights, the right to protect yourself, and the right to punish violators of the moral law. Locke thinks that everyone in the state of nature, which is going to be all humans, have these rights. And everybody has these rights equally. Nobody has a greater title to one of these rights than anyone else. So let's contrast this view of morality with Hobbes's view of morality. So remember, Hobbes thinks that in the state of nature, everyone is morally permitted to do anything at all. Because Hobbes thinks that in the state of nature, we are in a state of war. That is, the state of nature is a state of war. Now, Locke rejects the assumption, and he explicitly rejects it in the Second Treatise on Government, which is not in your excerpt, but we can at least see in your excerpts that Locke rejects the assumption that the state of nature is a state of war. And so since Locke thinks that the state of nature is not as bad as Hobbes does, Locke thinks that there are some things that are wrong to do in the state of nature. Hobbes seems to say that we can do anything in the state of nature, well, because the state of nature is a state of war. For Locke, the state of nature is not a state of war. So there are still some things we cannot do. Now, a third kind of position that one might take that is neither Hobbes or Locke's would say, well, I agree with Hobbes that the state of nature is a state of war, while also agreeing with Locke that there are some things that are wrong to do in the state of nature. You might think this view if you think that in a state of war, there are still things you can't do. So that's a third possible position that is neither Hobbes nor Locke's. So the next question we can look at is, well, what is the purpose of creating a political society? Why do we move from the state of nature to a political society? Now, Locke says that the purpose of creating political society is the securing, the regulating, and the protection of the lives, liberty, and property of everyone. So remember, Locke thinks that the state of nature has a moral law, and this moral law protects everybody's lives, liberty, and property. But there's a problem. In the state of nature, there are certain inconveniences that make using the moral law to protect our lives, liberty, and property very difficult. Locke outlines 3 inconveniences in the state of nature. First, he says people are biased and ignorant of the moral law. And because people are biased and ignorant, it's hard for everybody to come to agree to what the moral law is, and thus to accept it for themselves as binding on them. That sounds like a perfectly reasonable assumption. The second inconvenience that Locke says is that everyone's bias makes it difficult to establish a neutral judge with the authority to settle disputes between people. So again, if me and you, as we saw in Hobbes, if me and you have a conflict and we try to sort it out ourselves, we're going to have a problem. We're going to have a problem because I'm biased in ruling in favor of myself, and you're biased in ruling in favor of yourself. So Locke says in the state of nature, we don't really have anyone established to fairly and neutrally arbitrate our disputes. And the third kind of inconvenience that Locke points out is that in the state of nature, even if we can agree to what the moral law is, even if we have neutral judges to settle disputes, there's no power strong enough to enforce the moral law in the state of nature. So again, this is similar to Hobbes. If there's no government, people are just doing their own thing. But when it comes time to make sure that the wrongdoers get punished, we don't really have any way to physically keep them in check. So the important point to remember here is that although the purpose of getting out of the state of nature and moving into political society seem to be very similar between Hobbes and Locke, their purposes are actually different. For Hobbes, the purpose of creating society is to get out of a state of war. But Locke doesn't think the state of nature is a state of war. So his reason for getting out of the state of nature must be different than Hobbes. Now, Locke's reason for getting out of the state of nature is that in the state of nature, it's hard to enforce justice. It's hard to enforce the moral law. But it's not impossible for Locke. Notice here, Locke thinks that there is justice and there is a robust morality in the state of nature. Remember, Hobbes thought there is no justice and there is no injustice in the state of nature. For Hobbes, in the state of nature is a state of war and anything goes. But for Locke, in the state of nature, well, yeah, I'm allowed to do some things, but I'm not allowed to do other things. And if I do other things to you, I wrong you. So the big difference here is that Hobbes thinks we need to create political society to have justice. But Locke thinks, well, there's already justice in the state of nature, but we need to create political society to help it run a little more smoothly. So, big difference between the two views. So what does each person give up upon entering society? Well, Locke says, first, the inconveniences in the state of nature lead each person to give up their right to protect themselves. And they give up this right to society so that society can protect each individual and protect everybody as a whole. And second, each person gives up their right to punish wrongdoers. So remember, Locke thinks in the state of nature we all have a right to punish wrongdoers, but we give up this right to the state, so only the state has the right to punish wrongdoers. And this makes sense because if we're in the state of nature and I think you commit a wrong and I come up to you and say, you committed a wrong according to the moral law, so I'm going to punish you. And you say, no, I didn't commit a moral wrong. The moral law allows me to do what I did. So then we have a disagreement. How do we settle the disagreement? Well, we're both biased. Maybe I might want to get somebody, but maybe I want to get my friend to resolve our dispute. And you don't want my friend to resolve the dispute. Similarly, you want to get your friend to resolve the dispute, but I don't want your friend. So this is an example of how everybody's right to punish in the state of nature doesn't really work out. But that's why Locke says, well, we give up our right to punish to the government, or we give up our right to punish when we create a government. That way we don't have these kinds of conflicts about the moral law. And so for Locke, when we give up our right to protect ourselves and our right to punish wrongdoers, the state is the only entity in society with these rights. And when the state is the only entity in society with these rights, then the state can effectively and successfully protect everyone, protect their lives, their liberty, and their property. So the two rights we give up when we create political society for Locke are the right to protect ourselves and the right to punish. This is essentially the same as Hobbes, but there's a big difference for Hobbes. For Hobbes, when we give up these rights, we give them up absolutely. But for Locke, we give up these rights only on certain conditions. And we'll see what those conditions are in a bit. Now, another important question. What is the moral justification for creating a political society? We just saw the reason why we create political society, but the reason why we create political society is not necessarily the same as a moral justification for creating political society. So, from what I said so far, it might seem that Locke thinks that the moral justification for everybody giving up their rights is to protect the lives, liberty, and property of everybody. Of course, that's what Locke is concerned about. But this isn't right. Locke doesn't think that what justifies creating political society is the protection of life, liberty, and property. Rather, Locke says that what justifies creating political society, or what justifies giving up our rights, is consent. Consent is the moral basis for creating society. Because in consenting with others, we create a political community. And doing that is within our rights. And in doing so, we don't interfere wrongfully with the rights of others. Right? So I'm going to read this quote. Locke says, quote, "And thus, that which begins and actually constitutes any political society is nothing but the consent of any number of free men capable of a majority to unite and incorporate into such a society. And this is that," he's speaking of consent, "and that only which did or could give beginning to any lawful government in the world." So to understand why consent is so important for Locke, we need to see that Locke thinks that consent is necessary to justify political authority. Because if we were to include a member into a political society without his or her consent, then we would violate that person's moral right to life, liberty, and property. That is, if we create a political community over here, and then we say, you're going to join us, and you say, well, I don't really want to join you. And we say, no, you are going to join us. If you don't, we're going to, I don't know, beat you up or something. It might be the case that if you join us, we can better protect your right to life, liberty, and property than you would if you didn't join us. But Locke thinks, nevertheless, that would be wrong for us to do. Because in the state of nature, you have a moral right to decide how you're going to live your life, how you're going to use your liberty, and how you're going to use your property. And so if we decide for you and coerce you into joining our political society, then we violated your right. So consent is necessary for a moral justification of one's entering political society. Right? Locke says that the natural law grants every person, or makes every person, an absolute lord of his own person and possession, equal to the greatest and subject to nobody. So everybody is a king in their own right. Now, there are two ways that we can consent to the government's rule according to Locke. First, there's explicit consent, and second, there is tacit consent. So, an explicit consent to a political authority is the stronger form of consent. When one explicitly consents to a government, then one loses their rights to protect themselves and punish so long as that government exists. So you lose it forever, right? It's gone. But implicit consent is much weaker. Locke says when one implicitly consents to a government, one loses their rights to protect themselves and punish, but they only lose that right insofar as they enjoy the benefits of the government's rule. So only insofar as you use the roads, go to public school, get a tax refund maybe, only insofar as you receive the benefits are you bound to that government, because you've implicitly consented but not explicitly consent. So I'm not going to go through this here, but I think we're going to talk about this in a later class. But remember the objections I raised to consent theory and the Credo. You might want to think about how those objections work against Locke's theory of consent. Now, on the issue of what morally justifies the creation of political society, we didn't get too specific into this issue for Hobbes. But let me say that Hobbes believes that we consent to give up our rights to create a government. But importantly for Hobbes, Hobbes believed that this consent may be legitimately coerced. So for Hobbes, if a conqueror comes into town and demands everybody's obedience, people are going to agree to obey, because if not, they're going to, get slapped around or something. And importantly for Hobbes, everybody's agreement will be binding on them. So it's legitimate to coerce somebody into agreeing to join a political community, and Hobbes thinks that's perfectly fine. Of course, we already know why he thinks that's fine, because in the state of nature, you can do whatever you want. But Locke disagrees. Locke thinks an agreement to join a political society is binding only if the consent is voluntary. The consent cannot be coerced. So if we think that Locke's justification for political authority is really consent-based, then given what I said about Hobbes, we shouldn't take Hobbes as thinking the justification for creating political society is consent-based. Rather, we should understand Hobbes' justification for creating political society is getting out of the state of war, right? We want to do whatever you can to get out there, to get out of that state, whether you're coerced or not. So differences in the moral justification of political society. For Hobbes, it's whatever you can to get out of the state of war. For Locke, it has to be consent. So what are the limits to the government's authority for Locke? For Locke, the terms of consent to the creation of political society set its limits. Governments are granted the sole right to make and enforce laws because governments can preserve the life, liberty, and property of everybody. So Locke thinks that we create governments, we consent to them voluntarily because we trust them to promote the common good by making laws that keep everybody safe, by providing judges that can resolve disputes according to those laws, and by punishing bad guys, right? If we didn't have one state to do this, it would be very confusing. Maybe not a state of war, as Hobbes thought, but still very confusing. So we institute governments to promote the common good. Now, for Locke, that reason for instituting governments define its limits. So when the governments act in a way that opposes the common good, then the government oversteps its limits. When the government harms the liberty, the life, and the property of persons, then the government oversteps its limits. So what Locke takes this to mean is that all governments must be democratic, and he talks about there must be a legislative assembly that's elected, no taxation without representation, and so on and so forth. But the main idea is that the limits of government require that governments are democratic, and they must be democratic to be morally legitimate. Without that, governments cannot be legitimate. And this is the important point for Locke. Governments can never hold absolute or arbitrary power. Now, if we think about Hobbes thinks there are no limits to government. Governments can do whatever they want, and whatever they say, whatever they command, they have a right to command. Now, as I explained last time, Hobbes thinks the governments are absolute because any limits we place on government can lead back to a state of nature. They can lead back to disagreements that'll spiral down into the state of war that we want to avoid. Right? But Locke flips this kind of reasoning on its head. Locke says, no, governments cannot be absolute, and governments must have limits. And Hobbes says governments are absolute, and they must be absolute, and they must have no limits. So that's the different conclusions for both of their views. And I think hopefully you can see that they arrive at these different conclusions because of the different grounds for creating political society. For Hobbes, whatever you can to get out of the state of war. And if it's true that a totalitarian or an absolute government is necessary, then that's what we have to do. But for Locke, the grounds are consent. So whatever is our reason for consenting to government, that's going to set the limits. And Locke tells us the reason for consenting to government is the protection of life, liberty, and property. So the life, liberty, and property of every person are what set the limits to government. Okay, and now we come to the last question. What can citizens do when governments overstep their limits? Now, this question doesn't arise for Hobbes because there are no limits to a legitimate government. But for Locke, there are limits. And so, of course, the question is, what happens when governments overstep their limits? So, when a government acts in a way that's contrary to the common good, or acts in a way that harms the lives, liberty, and property of its citizens, Locke says that governments forfeit their right to govern. So they have a right to do things, but when they overstep their bounds, they lose that right. And when a government loses that right, then a government goes back into a state of nature with respect to the people or the citizens that instituted that government. But governments just don't go back into a state of nature. with respect to the people that instituted that government. They're in a state of war with the people that created them. So Locke thinks there is such a thing as a state of war. Of course, he doesn't think that the state of nature is always a state of war. But Locke does think, yeah, in the state of nature, there can be a state of war between people when they want to kill each other. Well, when a government harms its people, a government initiates a state of war with its people. And so they're in a war with respect to each other. And so for Locke, a people can treat their own government as an enemy. And for Locke, the people have a right to defend themselves against their government, and they have a right to destroy their governments. Just the same way, if somebody was trying to kill me, I have a right to defend myself against that person, and I have a right to destroy them if the harm is great enough. So Locke thinks that when a government oversteps its limits, the people can get rid of that government, and they have a moral right to do that, and they have a moral right to institute a new government. Now, of course, this way of thinking about the limits of governments and the legitimate responses to the limits of governments is the basis for revolutionary politics, right? This is at the heart of the American Revolution. And again, many of the founding fathers were very, very well acquainted with Locke's theory of revolution. And the Declaration of Independence, of course, is a very Lockean document, and all the other kinds of things you'll learn about when you take, a standard history course. But hopefully now you can see the reasoning, more of the philosophical reasoning behind revolutionary politics. And I want to point out that, at the time, this was a very controversial view, because at the time, the right of kings to hold their power was thought to be by divine right. That is, God instituted this king and gave this king authority to rule over the people. And so if you were to say, well, we have a right to overthrow this king and put in whoever we want to rule, well, there's a sense in which you're not just going against the king, but you're going against God's commands. And that's really bad. But on Locke's theory, you don't go against God's commands. Now, Locke himself was a Christian, so he believed in God, but his theory allowed you to go against governments without going against God, because the reason why we create governments is to protect ourselves. So Locke doesn't think that kings get their governments directly from God. That kings get their power directly from God, but rather kings get their power directly from the people. And that is why the people have the right to get rid of bad governments. And I'll just end with contrasting this with Hobbes. So for Hobbes, there can be no legitimate right to revolution. You just can't do that, because once you institute a government, you've gotten out of the state of nature, and you have a duty to do whatever you can to keep that government. So Hobbes' theory really aims to prevent revolutions, while Locke's theory, on the other hand, wants to make possible revolutions. So different aims in both of their views. Now, I will say Hobbes' view has some advantages that Locke's has. Locke's view has some advantages that Hobbes doesn't have. So look, Hobbes' view has the advantage of social stability. If the main concern is to get out of a state of war, and if it's true that governments are always better than a state of war, even if they're really bad governments, well, society is always going to be stable. Now, stable doesn't necessarily mean good. Stable just means that things are going to be working and things will get moving, even if they're not moving in a good way. But things won't change. You won't have, the country going into civil war. They come back, they go into civil war, and civil war, kind of what happened with England around this time. So Hobbes's view has that advantage, and Locke's does not, right? If governments are subject to revolution, then the people just have to agree that the governments are doing bad, and we tell the government to get out, and they don't want to get out. We have to have a war. We kick them out and institute a new government. Oh, we don't like that government, kick them out, right? And so there's always the possibility that you're going to have, the LA riots or something like that. We don't like the police. We get rid of the police. There's a war. But at the same time, Locke's view has the advantage that you can secure good governments, right? Because once governments start acting bad, we can get rid of them. So there's a check on government power. Of course, Hobbes's view doesn't have that check. Once you have a government, it's there forever. It can do whatever it wants. So there's no check. So you might ask, what you think is more important? Do you think getting out of a state of war and having social stability is more important than having a good government? Even though you might like a good government, you might want social stability or security of social stability no matter what. Or maybe you think, no, it's not good enough just to have government, but we need good government. And if we can't have good government, well, then we might as well just have the state of war. So whether you value stability or good government might pull you in either Hobbes's or Locke's direction. Okay, so that's all I've got for you today. Hopefully you could follow along with this lecture. Hopefully it wasn't too long. And I will update you on any assignments or things I want you to do before Monday. Have a good weekend.